Sofia is 43. She works as a senior strategist at a management consultancy, a role she has held for 8 years and performed with a level of competence that her colleagues and clients consistently recognize. She has been described, since childhood, as reserved. At school, it was noted as a slight concern. In early career assessments, it was flagged as a development area. By now, at 43, she has developed it into something that looks, from the outside, like the opposite. She presents fluently in client meetings, is visible on the company's internal social platforms, regularly facilitates workshops for groups of 40 or more, and has built a professional network she maintains with careful, consistent effort. She is exhausted in a way that sleep does not fix. Not the ordinary tiredness of demanding work. She has managed that for years and knows its rhythm. Something else. A baseline depletion that resets only partially even after adequate rest, as if the energy account from which she is drawing has been running a slow deficit for a very long time. Her GP has run the standard panels. Nothing is clinically notable. Her therapist has suggested burnout, which Sofia does not dispute but finds insufficient. The burnout explanation does not reach what she suspects is the actual problem, which is not that the work is too demanding, but that a specific dimension of the work, the continuous performance of visibility, the requirement to be socially present and energetically available across 12 hours of an open-plan day, punctuated by Zoom calls and client dinners, extracts from her a cost that the same quantity of solitary, focused analytical work does not. She has never had a vocabulary for this distinction. She has been handed a vocabulary by popular culture, introvert. But the popular version of that word does not help her understand why the distinction exists, or what it means about how a human psyche works, or what the long-term consequences might be of asking a particular kind of psyche to perform the opposite of its natural orientation continuously for 2 decades. Jung had a vocabulary. It is considerably more precise. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The case presented is entirely fictional, constructed to illustrate a psychological concept. Jung's theory of psychological types is one of his most widely known contributions and one of his most thoroughly misunderstood. The misunderstanding originates partly in the popularization of his ideas. The Myers-Briggs type indicator, derived from Jung's typology, became one of the most widely administered personality assessments in the world, and in the process simplified Jung's far more nuanced framework into a system of fixed categorical labels. Jung's actual conception is different in ways that matter. The full treatment of psychological types occupies all of Volume 6 of the collected works, a dense, carefully argued text in which Jung traces the history of the introversion-extraversion distinction across Western intellectual and cultural history before developing his own systematic account. The work is not a personality test. It is an attempt to describe the fundamental attitudes that determine how libido, what Jung called psychic energy, flows in relation to the outer and inner worlds. In Jung's framework, the concept of libido does not carry the narrowly sexual meaning Freud gave it. Libido, for Jung, refers to psychic energy in the general sense, the motivational and attentional capacity of the psyche, the force that drives engagement, attention, and vitality. The extrovert, in Jung's definition, is not simply a sociable person. The extrovert attitude is a fundamental orientation of the psyche in which libido flows naturally toward the outer world, toward objects, people, situations, and events. The outer world is energizing for someone with a dominant extrovert attitude. Engagement with it generates rather than depletes the psychic resources available. The introvert is not simply a shy or quiet person. The introverted attitude is a fundamental orientation in which libido flows naturally toward the inner world, toward reflection, interior processing, the subjective dimension of experience. The outer world makes demands on the introvert's attention that the outer world does not make on the extrovert's. Not because the introvert is weaker or less capable, but because the introvert's psychic system is oriented differently. The direction of natural flow is inward, and movement against that flow requires expenditure rather than replenishment. In CW6, Jung described the introverted attitude as one in which the decisive factor is the subjective relation to the object, the interior response, rather than the object itself. The introvert does not first respond to the outer world and then reflect. The introvert first reflects, and the reflection shapes the response. The processing sequence is reversed. This is not a personality quirk or a social preference. It is a description of how psychic energy is generated and spent. And that description has consequences for what happens to a person who is structurally introverted and is required, by the demands of their professional environment, to perform the opposite orientation continuously for 20 years. Jung was explicit about something that popular typology consistently obscures. The introversion-extraversion distinction is not a binary. No individual is purely introverted or purely extrovert. What varies is the dominant attitude, the orientation that is more naturally accessible, that requires less energy to maintain, that is more congruent with the deeper organization of the psyche. In healthy development, Jung argued, the auxiliary or inferior function provides some access to the non-dominant orientation. The structurally introverted person has some capacity for extrovert engagement. The structurally extrovert person has some capacity for introverted reflection. The question is never whether the non-dominant mode is available. It is always available, to some degree, but at what cost? This is the crucial clinical point that Sofia's situation illustrates. She can present to a group of 40 clients. She can maintain a professional network with genuine effort. She can perform the extrovert demands of her role with a level of competence that is indistinguishable from the outside, from someone for whom those activities are naturally energizing. The difference is entirely in the energy account. For someone whose dominant attitude is extrovert, those activities replenish. For someone whose dominant attitude is introverted, they deplete, and the depleted energy must be recovered through the activity that is natural: solitude, reflection, engagement with the interior world. Sofia's working environment provides almost no structural space for that recovery. The open-plan office, one of the most consequential architectural decisions in the recent history of knowledge work, is designed, in explicit terms, for collaborative, socially available, continuously interactive engagement. It is, in Jungian typological terms, an environment architecturally optimized for the extrovert attitude and architecturally hostile to the introverted one. There is no space to think without being visible. There is no space to process without being available. The physical environment is a continuous demand on the psyche's extrovert capacity. The proliferation of communication technologies, the always accessible message platform, the expectation of rapid response, the Zoom culture that makes geographic distance irrelevant while making the performance of social availability mandatory, even at home, has extended this architecture into every hour of the professional day, including the hours that previously offered natural introverted recovery. The consequence, for someone with Sofia's typological orientation, is what she accurately describes: a deficit that sleep does not fully address. Sleep is not the recovery mechanism the introverted orientation requires. The recovery mechanism the introverted orientation requires is the experience of genuine interior space, time in which the outer world's demands are suspended and the inner world's movements can be processed without external pressure. This is not luxury or preference. In the Jungian framework, it is a physiological equivalent, the equivalent of asking someone to run continuously without adequate oxygen and being puzzled that they cannot sustain the pace. There is an important additional dimension to this problem that goes beyond energy management. Jung's typological framework does not just describe how psychic energy flows. It describes how meaning is generated. The introverted attitude generates meaning through the subjective dimension, through the depth of the interior response to experience. When the introverted orientation is chronically suppressed in favor of the extrovert performance, it is not just energy that is depleted. It is the primary mechanism by which the person makes meaning of their own experience. Sofia has been professionally visible for 20 years. She has, in that time, generated a great deal of external content: presentations, analyses, client communications, social interactions. She has had very little time to process the interior significance of any of it. The accumulated experience of 20 years of professional life exists, in her psychology, as a surface phenomenon. things she did, things that happened, outcomes she produced. It has not been metabolized into the deeper currency that the introverted orientation converts experience into. The felt sense of meaning, the developed interiority, the relationship to the self's own depths that is the introverted personality's characteristic form of wealth. The MBTI, which derived its introversion-extraversion distinction from Jung's typology, became a cultural fixture partly because it gave people a language for something they recognized in their experience. But Jung's framework is considerably less static than its MBTI derivative. Jung did not regard the types as fixed categories. He regarded them as descriptions of dominant tendency, and he was clear that the individuation process, the movement towards psychological wholeness, requires developing some relationship with the non-dominant orientation. The fully individuated person is not purely introverted or purely extrovert. They have access to both, with one dominant but the other genuinely available. That is a different formulation from find out which type you are and adjust your workplace accordingly. Return to Sofia. She is 43, professionally accomplished, and running an energy deficit that has been accumulating for the better part of 2 decades. The deficit is not dramatic. It is, in fact, invisible to everyone who interacts with her because what is depleted is not the performance. The performance remains excellent, but the interior life behind the performance. This is the specific damage of the long-term suppression of the dominant attitude. It is not visible from the outside, and it is not fully visible from the inside either, because the person has adapted to the depletion and normalized it. Sofia does not think of herself as exhausted in any clinical sense. She thinks of herself as managing a demanding career. The distinction between those two framings is not available to her within her current framework, because the current framework does not include a category for the slow erosion of the primary mechanism by which a particular kind of person generates meaning. The Jungian typological framework makes the distinction visible. It allows a different question, not how to manage the demands better, but what the demands have been costing that is not recoverable through the standard maintenance of sleep, exercise, and occasional vacation. The cost is interior. It is the cost of 20 years of generating external content, presentations, analyses, professional visibility, without adequate time for the interior processing that is not a luxury for someone with Sofia's typological orientation, but the precondition for the work being genuinely hers rather than simply competent. There is a diagnostic available in Sofia's experience that she has not yet fully used. She has noted that the depletion associated with the open-plan social availability and the Zoom calls is different in quality from the depletion associated with intensive solitary analysis of a complex strategic problem. Both are demanding. Only one depletes in the way that does not fully recover. The distinction is pointing at something. It is pointing at the orientation Jung described. The activities that flow with the dominant attitude replenish even when they are demanding. The activities that flow against it deplete, even when they are professionally successful. This diagnostic does not solve Sofia's professional situation. The world she works in will not reorganize its architecture around typological theory, but it changes the relationship to the situation. There is a difference between understanding one's exhaustion as a personal deficit, a failure of resilience, a development area, and understanding it as the predictable consequence of a structural mismatch between a psyche's dominant orientation and the environment in which it is being asked to operate. The first framing produces shame and effort to overcome. The second produces information and the possibility of making different choices on the margins about where and how recovery is deliberately constructed. One might ask, without the vocabulary of type labels, without the MBTI framework, without any pre-existing category, what kind of activity, when it is done for several hours without interruption, produces something that functions like replenishment rather than depletion? Not rest, that is a different category, but activity, work, engagement, attention directed towards something. Whether what produces that quality of replenishment is predominantly of the interior kind, reading, sustained analysis, solitary creative work, contemplation, or predominantly of the exterior kind, conversation, collaboration, social engagement, the management of relationships and events. The honest answer to that question is more informative than any personality inventory. One might also consider whether the activities that have been most rewarded in one's professional life correspond to the orientation that is naturally replenishing, or to its opposite, and what that correspondence or mismatch has been costing over the duration of the career. The cultural dimension of this problem deserves a direct observation. The architecture of contemporary knowledge work, the open office, the synchronous communication requirement, the visibility expectation, the always available platform culture, was not designed with typological diversity in mind. It was designed, explicitly, around collaborative and interactive models of work that assume the extrovert attitude as the baseline. This is not a conspiracy against introverts. It is the unreflective default of workplace designers operating within a cultural framework that has, since at least the early 20th century, treated extrovert qualities as the self-evident markers of professional competence, leadership capacity, and organizational value. The consequence for the significant portion of the professional workforce that does not share that dominant orientation is the situation Sofia represents. People performing at a high level while running a chronic deficit in the orientation that is actually most congruent with how their psyche works. The performance is real. The cost is real and largely invisible. And the standard response is more resilience, better self-care, different time management. Address the surface of the situation while the structural mismatch continues to operate beneath it. Jung's typological framework does not provide a solution to this structural problem. What it provides is a more accurate description of the problem, which is the precondition for any response that reaches the actual level at which the problem exists. Sofia's exhaustion is a precise record of a two-decade mismatch between the dominant orientation of her psyche and the primary demands of her professional environment. It is not a failure of resilience. It is the predictable consequence of asking a particular kind of psyche to perform the opposite of its natural flow, continuously, without adequate recovery, while calling the performance a development achievement. Jung's typological framework does not resolve the structural problem. It names it accurately, which is where any genuine response must begin. This is educational content exploring Jungian psychology. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you are struggling, please seek qualified help. The Shadow Work PDF, 5 Questions to Begin, is available through the link in the description. Subscribe if this kind of examination is useful. The remaining concepts in this series address dimensions of psychological life that are equally specific, equally consequential, and equally absent from most professional development frameworks.